I grew up in Connecticut, and so the first museum that I ever went to when I was really young was the Peabody, which is a science museum in New Haven. And I remember particularly liking the dioramas. As you get older, you might make fun of a diorama, but when you're a little kid, there's this scene, and it's really well done, and it's whatever from history. And I went back. What's interesting is I went back maybe 10 years ago. They had done an exhibit on Machu Picchu, and I went back, and I was in a sense pleasantly surprised because it was much more immersive and it was much more engaging. And I'd been to Machu Picchu, so it was like I'm getting a lot out of this experience. And I know certainly the museums that the two of you have been involved with have done a lot to bring yourself into the community more. So I don't know if you had the same. What was your first museum experience?
My first museum experience was probably a Smithsonian. I don't remember the exact specifics, but I'm sure it was a Smithsonian and it was a school field trip,
Because you grew up in Arlington.
I grew up in Arlington, yeah.
Right.
So that would be mine.
And your first?
Yeah, so I don't remember the very first one, but I know that a lot of people work in museums, including me. We remember going to historic houses, and there's the velvet rope, and you can't go behind that velvet rope. And everybody who works in history, I want to go behind that velvet rope. And that's really drove my interest in museums. There must be something amazing behind that rope that I want to get to. I wanted to get to the third floor. I wanted to touch the artifacts. I wanted to see what nobody else was able to see.
So I was in Switzerland 20 years ago, and I did not know the invisible velvet rope existed. So I wasn't like going over to the furniture, but I was a little too close, and a couple of guys came. So, I learned. But I'm blanking on the artist's name, but he does, out of steel, huge sculptures of Impressionist paintings, like life-size. And the installation at the museum usually then features the painting. And I went with my son, who at the time was only about 5, 6 years old, and my mother. And it was very much, you can touch the exhibits. And she had the best time she's ever had in the museum. And he was very happy. But I always like when they do that. They change a little bit, they engage the museum goer.
Yeah. When I've been at the Sandy Spring Museum now for 12 years. When I interviewed for the job, one of the board members said, "We don't want one of those museums where you can't touch anything."
Like right from the top, and like the whole wow.
Yeah.
Right. We just have signs saying "Do not touch." Stay off.
But part of your activities, like the history walks that you've done with the community, that's obviously something where you're not in the museum. The museum is coming out of its walls, but you're sharing that history in a very way, and people see and they walk with you and they hear all the stories, and it's a very engaging.
And I'm like living history with them by being here, talking about the old times here at Arlington, Yeah, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then we go back to the George Washington's era.
Right.
Yeah, and we talk about the Syphax family.
Right. So, have you had a highlight in your work at the museum?
My career or at the museum?
At the museum.
At Sandy Spring Museum? So the museum was founded to talk about the history of Quakers. So Quakers would be the first permanent settlers in the area. Of course, there were indigenous people who were forced out of the area. Anyway, so Quakers very well documented their local history, and there's tons of artifacts and photographs and documents. And the community has changed dramatically since the museum was founded, and people don't have that same interest. Not everybody's interested in the Quakers. It's not my ancestors, it's not your ancestors. Why should I come to this museum? So when I was hired, I needed to rethink why people should come to this museum. And what we ended up doing was focusing on the fact that the area has become incredibly multicultural. And we started going out and doing oral histories and meeting people who are representing all of these vastly different cultures. And what we discovered is that people from underrepresented cultures didn't have their own space. So they weren't being represented by the large cultural arts organizations, and space is really expensive in Montgomery County. So we just started opening the doors and saying, well, you want to do something, come in our building and do it. And that just took off. Like, what people wanted to do were things that we never would have been able to do ourselves. We never would have come up with them. We didn't know the cultural traditions, but they're all in Montgomery County, all of these things that are happening that now we're able to share with the public.
Right. And you had a highlight with your work with the Black Heritage?
Freedmen's Village is mainly our go-to, and segregation, because that happened here in Arlington, desegregation.
Right.
And Freedmen's Village we talk about because that's right in our backyard. Yep, and we focus on that, about that period after the Civil War. We ask for donations of artifacts from everybody in Arlington every time we have an event or book signing or something, and they trickle in, and and so we have it there, but they always want it back, soon. They always want it back soon, like maybe 2 months.
Well, because the things that the museum is interested in are things that a family treasures.
Right.
And a lot of those families in Arlington are still very strong and around, and so
it's a keepsake to them.
Yeah, they don't. Mm-hmm. They literally don't belong in a museum. They belong with the family.
Yeah, the family museum at the matriarch's house of the family,
right.
Or something. Yeah.
That's great. Well,
Yeah.
That is one way in which museums are changing. There's something called shared stewardship. So the museum doesn't own what your what the important things are, but we can provide a safe place for them.
Right.
So I really like that model.
Okay.
That maybe you could offer that to people, that you can provide a safe place for their precious family artifacts, but they still belong to them.
I'll look into that.
Depends on your scope. I mean, that's an interesting thing about Sandy Spring, is that it used to be this very tiny, isolated village, and you could kind of collect everything. But now it's this multicultural, cosmopolitan area, and you can't collect everything. So we do a lot more in terms of just showing people's history rather than collecting it. We try to share it with people. Yeah, it's definitely part of the changing, it's part of the evolution of museums, that it used to be much more about preservation. I mean, it's still about preservation. We focus a lot more on access. We feel like if we're not providing access, then why are we saving all of this information?
And I think the important thing is not the preservation, but the authenticity.
But that's the catch. What is the authentic story?
I know. I guess you have to be careful. You have to be sure. It's important to have it driven by the people in the community. Like they have kind of ownership of it. Like it's their story they're sharing. Does that come up when you plan programs?
Oh God, yeah. I mean,
how do you deal with that?
So it's a very interesting story in Sandy Spring. So it's a Quaker community, and Quakers were very active in the abolitionist movement. And so all people talk about is, Quakers freed enslaved people 50 years before the Civil War. And I'm thinking, but wait a minute, that means Quakers enslaved people. Like, why are we not telling that part of the story? And so we started really researching that, because I did not want to tell this one sentence. One sentence does not tell this very complicated story. And, it turns out some people freed enslaved people, some people freed only certain people, people of certain ages, some people freed upon their death, some people, everything was very, very different. And in most cases, the freed people stayed on the land. They were then servants, and they worked the fields, but they weren't paid, their wages that would have been what they would have had to pay a white person to work. So we've stopped telling that story. We won't tell that story anymore.
Right. But it's part of history, but we want to
tell the whole story. We don't want to tell this one slice that is a very slanted story that one group was telling without giving agency to anybody else.
Right. And does that come up with the Black Heritage Museum? Do you have to think about what stories to share, or how do you do the program?
We don't think of it like that. We think of we have we go ahead of ourselves and say that when in October we're going to do this, and then like September we're going to do this kind of thing. So we get ahead of ourselves, but we don't think about how it's going to react the public. You know, we want a reaction. You know, we're looking for a reaction, you know, kind of thing. Talk about it, you know, we're trying to create a conversation more or less. So we don't worry about what they're going to think. We want them to think, you know. So, and we, do you have interactive things at your museum? Okay, so we're just starting to get involved with interactive things. The museum is like going in a direction that wants to enhance the community. So like when new teachers come to this area, we want them to come there so that they will understand, you know, the history of this area and incorporate that in their teaching to the kids. Yeah.
And what's the future for Santa Fe Museum?
So we're actually putting on an addition. It's called the Cultural Heritage Hub. That's a space that's going to be accessible to folk artists 24/7. There's an exterior door, but it's an addition to the museum that they can use for whatever purpose they want to. So like I said, space is at a premium, and we want to make sure that we're supporting artists, that they can carry on these cultural traditions, that space will not be an issue for them. So we literally just broke ground a week ago. Very excited.